On digital radio,
92 to 95 FM.
and 810 medium wave.
BBC Radio Scotland.
Hello, this is Azwa Shamsuddin and welcome to From Bench to Bedside, Health Research in Action.
And I'm Kirsty Bayliss. In today's show, we'll be looking at different stages of health research and meeting some of the researchers behind it.
We hope that today's show will bring you up to date with some of the latest research in health, but also demystify some of the common misconceptions of health research.
Today, we have with us 3 PhD researchers from the University of Edinburgh who are doing some cutting-edge research into the fields of neuroscience and nursing.
Firstly, we have Tiago Marcos in the studio with us this morning. How are you, Tiago? Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. I'm feeling fine in this beautiful morning in Glasgow. Thank you for having me.
Now, Tiago, I understand that your research is in the field of neuroscience. Could you tell our listeners today more about your research?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work in the field of neurodevelopment, which broken down is kind of trying to understand how every time an embryo grows into adulthood, how is it that the organism always, well, most of the times gets it right. So try to understand how different tissues that are formed from different cells. How is it that, your brain cells have different characteristics, say, than your liver cells? So using an analogy here, one of the ways of explaining this is if you have a recipe for a cake, right, and you follow the recipe, you get a certain kind of cake, right? However, if you have a slightly different recipe, you'll get a slightly different cake. So it's that. The genes give you instructions, and then the cell follows those instructions and eventually grows into a mature cell that performs certain functions. What happens a lot of the times is that during development, different streams of cells become different kinds of cake because they follow different kinds of recipes. So my research is pretty much trying to understand exactly what each cell lineage does and what recipes it follows and what factors create the cake, let's say.
Great. Well, that's some very exciting research there, and I'm sure it's got huge implications. Can you tell me what this means for society in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. What I do is called basic research. So we're interested in exploring mechanisms and how they work. So in the first place, it doesn't seem that there is that much of a clinical outcome because, yes, okay, you understand how a certain type of cell is formed, but why should we care about it? Now, the reason why we should care about it is, first of all, sheer curiosity is actually what drives the world into new discoveries. So, for example, if you think about sharks for a wee second, the shark teeth system actually works as a conveyor belt. And by exploring how that works and the fact that sharks can grow teeth into adulthood, you actually then may be able to understand how to form, a new tooth in adult life. So the sheer curiosity of knowing how things work is very important. However, then in the terms of what I actually do, which is neurodevelopment, so you've all heard of neurodevelopmental diseases, say autism spectrum disorders or epilepsy. So if I understand how different cell types are formed at the cortex, I can start to understand what happens in health and disease. So I would say the clinical outcome would be, say, trying to understand what's happening behind epilepsy, for example.
Wow, that's amazing to hear. Could you tell me a little bit about how you arrived at this study?
At this study specifically? Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. I was always interested in the brain, so at the cortex. I personally always worked on the field of neuroscience because I took a neuroscience degree first, then I took a master's in neuroscience, and I was always fascinated with brains in general, with the brainstem, with the cerebellum, the different regions, the different parts. However, one of the things that always fascinated me is the ability that we have as scientists of perhaps altering certain organisms by, again, changing a bit of the recipe, right? And because the cortex is such a beautiful region for me and I'm so interested into, there was a project available in my lab where they had found out that one type of cell, by changing one little factor in the recipe, had become a different kind of cell, which is kind of the polar opposite of that cell. And I started to think, well, if we can change the recipe at specific points, could we produce a very specific type of neuron that performs a task that nature hasn't come up with yet? A sort of like chimera neuron that bypasses nature by us altering the recipe itself. So that's what drove me to this place.
That's a really interesting story there, Tiago. We'll hear more personal stories from our contributors as the show goes on. For now, I would like to move on to Clarissa, who studies early mobilisation of patients who've required the use of mechanical ventilation. Good morning, Clarissa. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Hello, good morning, Christy.
Now, Clarissa, I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about your study, but could you maybe start by just so the term mechanical ventilation, is that people who are on breathing machines?
Yeah, that's correct. So I'm interested in patient groups who are the sickest patient in the hospital, so who are being cared in an intensive care unit. And this study based on my personal experience. I work in a hospital, and then it's about early mobilization. Early mobilization is like physical exercise, such as sitting in a chair, sitting in the bed, or standing or walking. So research has shown that it's good for patients, the sickest patient who are still using this breathing machine, mechanical ventilation. So while it's just like Tiago interested in the recipe, my research is completely different from you, Tiago. So it's more about, if I can borrow the analogy of baking a cake. So mine is more about how the process, how to make the cake itself, to understand how the process, like for example, how to fold the dough, and how long will it take to put inside the oven, that sort of things. So
yeah, absolutely. The analogy works across like the range of biomedical sciences.
So in my study, I talked to nurses, physiotherapists, clinical support workers, and also the patients to understand again the process, how they do the physical exercise. So I hope my findings can inform the policy, hospital policy, and again, it's to improve better quality of care for the sickest patients in the hospital.
Absolutely. Do you find that people have misconceptions about nurse researchers?
Oh yeah, that's a very good question, because I often, if I introduce myself to people will say, when I said, okay, I'm doing PhD in nursing, and they will say nursery, and nursing and nursery is completely different world. And also sometimes people say that, oh, we didn't know that nurses have a PhD program. So probably the public should know, we nurses, we deal with clinical decisions all the time. So we require critical thinking. So that's why it's very important to have educated nurses. Again, the outcome, it will be good for the patient care.
Absolutely. So was it some of your personal experiences as a nurse that drove you to study this particular topic?
Yeah, so when I was working in intensive care unit, so I was very reluctant to mobilize or to do physical exercise with the sickest patients who are using the breathing machine.
Absolutely.
So usually we waited until the patients are being cared, are getting out from the intensive care unit and being cared on the ward. So, but it's when I read the articles, the journal articles saying that it's better for the patient, so I was kind of struck there. So that's why I picked the topic.
It's been an interesting morning here in the studio, and it's about to get better as we hear from Lisette Everles, who's also a nurse researcher, this time studying the process of organ donation. Good morning, Lisette. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, Lisette, could you tell us a bit about your research?
Yeah. As you said, I'm studying organ donation process, but specifically the process of approaching the families at the hospital. That means that, when sadly a patient passes away, and the patient has let's say the criteria to qualify as a potential organ donor, a group of nurses approach to the family basically to have the conversation about if they had this conversation before and move forward. And so to do so, I interview families who passed for this process, nurses as well, and also going to the hospital observing, how was all this about. And some of the preliminary findings are about that all the communication is just really strongly driven by emotions. And that is quite interesting because it actually sounds quite simple at the beginning, but because that moment is such a sensitive moment, we are approaching families. My colleagues are approaching families who just lost their family members. So obviously that is like a really shocking and really, a sad moment. However, these really skilled nurses need to, talk with the family and just rise if that was actually an option for them. And so far, we didn't have like any kind of research actually about like what is happening there. We have like different guidelines around, but it's been like really interesting to understand that the process of communication is actually driven by the emotions of the family, but also of the nurses as well. And that obviously opened like a huge, let's say, window and area to approach about how healthcare professionals actually manage their own emotions in moments like that, and also how this dialogue with the families, because usually the conception about it is like just the health professional ask a question and the family just, let's say, will respect the decision of their family member, but it seems like being more complex than that. So that is obviously a good thing.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing. We'll come back to the issue of emotions in research soon, because I think it's very interesting. Firstly, Lisette, could you, because I understand your data is from Chile, is it?
Yeah, I'm from Chile originally, so I'm funded for like the Chilean government. So all the data is actually coming from Chile. So I traveled there in order to collect and do all of these interviews. Interesting enough, the process seems to be like really similar everywhere. In terms of, as in many countries in Chile, are also nurses who are talking with the family, and it's like the similar case here in the UK. So, and also at the beginning, actually, I thought that some cultural differences will have like a role to play. However, the topic seems like more grounded in, something that is really human, which is emotions, families, and how actually we relate with them in terms of decisions, in terms of how important is respect these decisions, or even more interesting, like how unique is the moment in which this conversation at the hospital happened. So, it's obviously is like really kind of, let's say, emotionally challenging. Of course, it wasn't simple, but on the other hand, it's been like really like a privilege to be able to study this topic, and also the opportunity to just raise the voices of nurses and also the families, because all the time, we are thinking how we can do it better. And I think that the people like more empowered about this is people actually that already experienced that.
That's great. I'd like to address the issue of emotions in research a bit more, and this is open to everyone at the table. What do you find in the day-to-day of doing research? Is how do you think your emotions affect research, or how your research affects you emotionally? Because we're trying to bring the human forward a bit more in research for our listeners. Could anyone care to comment on that?
I can go ahead if you want. Maybe I could start by describing my day-to-day activities and kind of how that pans out into emotions. So I try to start early in the lab. I'm like a morning lark, so I like to be in the lab at about between 7 and 8. And I've noticed that like the days that I'm a bit more emotional, like experiments don't seem to work as well, which is a funny thing. So I do specifically electrophysiology, which involves basically prodding cells to listen to what they have to say. I guess that's kind of a simple way of putting it. This thing's called action potentials, and I'm interested in seeing what different neurons, what kind of different action potentials they do. And I've noticed that, yes, if I'm having a difficult day, it seems like collecting data becomes more difficult. I become more nervous. The way I touch the equipment is different. So I think this is why it's important in the world of research to feel accommodated towards your needs and not to feel too much under pressure from, say, your PI to get this specific amounts of data in a month, stuff like that. And, also finding ways of coping with your emotions so that you go to the lab with a fresh face and you know what you're doing. So, for example, in the morning, it really helps me to put some Pearl Jam songs in the morning. And that's how I kickstart my day, for example. So that's kind of my view on it.
Yeah, from my perspective, because I'm researching such a emotional. I never thought actually. I mean, obviously, if you're research in organ donation, is has this kind of burden about you need to talk about death and everything, and also this reluctance to talk about it. Actually, that was one of the first probably comments that I got when I had this idea. Okay, let's say 4 years ago already. But actually, it seems quite inspiring for me. Actually, I'm really kind of obviously committed, and doing the research, I've been passing through all range of emotions. Sometimes, I'm laughing like crazy because obviously they are telling and sharing experiences, obviously with a happy components, really funny ones, and also obviously some really sad. So I'm kind of in all of this range when I'm analyzing my data, from days laughing all the time. And obviously some days I'm crying also. But not in a bad thing. When I'm saying, I've been crying in my research, everybody's just what are you doing about it? It's just, I'm just crying and it's okay. Yeah. Because, it's part of the human thing, it's connection. Obviously I'm there too, I'm a person. So the way that I'm coping with that is just this feeling of being privileged. I like to dance too. I love traveling.
Absolutely.
So it's like everything. So it's not all the time looking let's say the grim part of that.
You just touched an interesting point about crying. Yeah, you cry a lot doing a PhD. But you kind of learn how to thrive on that, I guess.
Yeah. What about you, Carissa? How have you been?
So my experience probably quite similar like Tiago. I once had rejected by potential patient participant, which I found quite hard to recruit in my study. And then when she said, no, I'm not interested, because the previous day I came to her, and then she said that, okay, you can come next day. And I came there with my enthusiasm. And then she said, no, I'm not interested. But I couldn't force my participant, of course. So what I did, I just tell myself, it's not my bad day because I'm not sick. I'm healthy. So it's their bad day. So I need to really respect their decision. Yeah. So, yeah. And I cannot dance. Probably I should learn how to dance.
Yeah, please join us.
So I'll join you with that.
Yeah. I guess maybe to end on a slightly more upbeat note, what would you say is the best thing about your research? It's open to all of you if you have.
In my particular case, I think it has to be the fact that neuroscience is such a hot topic right now that a lot of people are very keen on learning about it. So I find that when I'm giving, because I also teach at university, and I find when I give tutorials about genetics or statistics, I always try to bring it back a bit to neuroscience, and people really listen to it. And I feel like when you work on something, if you have to teach it, it puts you in a position where you kind of have to really know your stuff.
Absolutely.
But also you see the light in the eyes of your students sometimes when they're like, that's what that means, especially in statistics, when they understand what the p-value actually means. So the best part of my job, I think, is actually fun enough which is the fact that after doing some research, I also get to teach about the methods and the scientific method. And for me, that's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, for me, I'm really happy. Probably doing research is one of the most amazing things to do because you have time to think, you have time to, push in the boundaries forward. And I would like to kind of, if I need to give a message, probably one of the things that make me really happy about doing research is that we need to talk more about, we are living and we have an end, and that end shouldn't be like a burden, should be just an opportunity for everybody. And I think that that is something that I've been learning from my research participants. So yeah,
I would echo Tiago and Lisette. I think the best part of the PhD is how much you learn from the journey.
Absolutely.
And I would never imagine that I can talk here to share about my research, because I thought it would be very, very academic and just behind my computer and then just doing research. But, this kind of opportunity.
Thank you all very much for coming. That's sadly all we have time for today. I'd like to thank our listeners for listening, and we can continue this conversation on Twitter using the hashtag From Bench to Bedside.
We'll join you again next week, same
On
time.
digital
Goodbye for
radio.
now.
92 to 95 FM.
And 810 medium wave.
BBC Radio Scotland.